are going to deal with the development of the Panchayat Raj. In the first place, we have to understand the etymology of the word Panchayat. Panchayat is derived from the root word panch, meaning 5. Originally, it meant a council of 5 village elders. In simplistic term, Panchayati Raj is a system of local self-government. Such system of local self-governments were prevalent in ancient India. Ancient India's texts are replete with references of such local self-governing bodies. Gana, Sabha, Samiti and Parishad in North India, while Naru, Brahmadaya and Periyanaru in South India were very well known. However, one thing we must remember, that is, though this idea of Panchayat is rooted in our Indian traditions, but the modern idea of Panchayat is derived from the notion of Indian village community that were later conjured up in the writings of early Orientalists like Sir William Jones, Mount Stuart Elphinston, John Malcolm, and later in the works of various colonial administrators. Now, one thing that we need to remember, that when the Britishers came to rule India, they were enamored of the Brahmanical civilization, not the folk civilization or not the non-Brahmanical culture, but it was the Brahmanical civilization that they felt should be looked upon. Hence, references to panchayats and Ganapadas in ancient Vedic texts translated into English for the first time by Orientalists played a great part in persuading them to believe that there was an elemental political unit in Indian society and politics. This idea found its most apt expression in Charles Metcalfe's defense of the Mahalwari revenue settlement that was adopted in the newly ceded and conquered territories of northwestern provinces. Now, describing the fortified villages which sprung up around Delhi in the years after the collapse of the Mughal power in 1761, Metcalfe wrote to the 1832 Select Parliamentary Committee on the East India Company's Charter in brilliant evocative terms, calling these village communities as little republics which had been totally independent, totally self-sufficient, and not at all dependent on any sort of foreign relations. He further pointed out that they seemed to last where nothing else lasted. Dynasty after dynasty tumbled down, but these village communities remained intact. Now, we see the British came as traders, but as they became administrators, they had a huge task upon them. Administering this huge territory that they came to acquire over a period of time was no simple task. And so they thought that if they reinstated these village communities, then their task would be much simplified. So the main purpose of their idea of the village community and of its panchayat or the council of elders was that they could easily delegate their responsibilities on a traditional authority. And if they did so, then of course it would bring down the cost of administration. It would be easier to maintain law and order. It would also curtail the cost of policing. And at the same time, it would avoid the time-consuming and controversial business of holding elections and then setting up local authorities to deal with matters such as street cleaning and petty theft. They felt that it would be better if they devolve these responsibilities to these local authorities. Now, what we see initially, the village community and its panchayat remained a first resort in case of any dispute, and this was the case of a large part of rural India. Now, there was a problem in this. The basic problem was that locality, lineage, and caste played a detrimental part in it. It was rather determined by these feelings of caste, and the so-called village panchayats were often no more than caste panchayats. Unfortunately, this situation prevails even to this day. Now, the panchayati system was not yet totally developed, and it was a poor apparatus upon which to heap the huge responsibility of British system of justice. One more thing that was detrimental to the development of this system of local self-government in India at that time, and that was the parallel development of the British court system meant that villagers were increasingly becoming reluctant to submit their disputes to the informal jurisdiction of a group of elderly high caste males, and when they did, they would often request the local British magistrate to overturn a judgment if that was not passed in their favor. Nonetheless, by the late 19th century, the ideal of village self-rule had become firmly entrenched in the minds of most colonial officials and indeed that of the wider public. Now, we would try to understand what were the initial attempts that were made in this direction. We see it was no great surprise that in the wake of Lord Ripon's enthusiasm for local self-government in the 1880s, attempts were made by William Wedderburn in Bombay, Elphinstone's former province, and by others to revive the village panchayat. However, just as many were enthused by the idea of these village panchayats, not everybody was happy about it. They were quite skeptical because they felt that such bodies were liable to corruption and were so much faction-ridden that it would be impossible for them to impartially administer any form of justice, no matter how trivial the limits of their authority might be. Things, however, started to change in 1920. In 1920, following the report of the Royal Commission on Decentralization and the Montagu-Chelmsford Report of 1980, this issue was taken up again, and village panchayats were formally vested with legal powers in no less than 5 provinces, including Punjab, Central Provinces, and the United Provinces. Of course, the British had their motives behind it. The question that might come to our mind is, what were the motivations behind this? Well, of course, economy was a strong motivation. There was also the desire that by conferring powers upon these villages, they could easily cut out the overeducated and to them increasingly troublesome class of collaborators upon whom they had been depending since the earliest times of their administration. And if power was vested in these local authorities, the Britishers hoped that then it might cement the bond between themselves and these loyal subjects. The composition of these village committees and the powers they exercised now varied enormously from province to province. Most were democratically elected, although in the United Provinces, all elections by the Gaon Sabha, that is the village assembly, had to be approved by the local magistrate. Now, of course, one thing that we should not negate while we discuss about the British involvement with the local self-government was the nationalist discourse. Ironically, it was during the same period when the British became increasingly interested with these local self-governing bodies and encouraging the Panchayati system and putting its role into statute. The idea of Panchayat also entered into nationalist discourse. However, the British wanted the reinstatement of Panchayati Raj for one reason. That was, it would be cheap and an easy means of indirect rule. But to the nationalists, it meant something else. It was a symbol of the type of democratic government which Mahatma Gandhi and others wished to see, supplanting that of the Europeans post-independence. Gandhi, of course, was well educated and deeply influenced not just by the Indian tradition but by a variety of Western writers, including Leo Tolstoy, whose vision of a self-sustaining community he absorbed. Now, Gandhi was a believer of village panchayat, a firm believer of village panchayat, but in spite of that, he fully accepted the practical limits to such a scheme. Others, however, were more enthusiastic. The idea of village development through self-regulated councils was in fact first deployed politically in India not by Gandhi but by Rabindranath Tagore as early as the 1900s. C.R. Das, the Bengali Swadeshi campaigner, was amongst those who also supported it. C.R. Das spoke on the issue during the presidential address to the Bengal Congress in 1918, advocating the growth of village council as a means of economic development. However, the policy was later written out of the manifesto of the Bengal Provincial Congress because of the pressure from the Zamindar lobby. In 1922, C.R. Das became president of the Indian National Congress, and in his presidential address, he again urged as a requisite of Swaraj the organization of village life and the practical autonomy of small local centers. Village communities, according to him, must not exist as disconnected units, but be held together by a system of cooperation and integration. As a result of this, an outline scheme of Swaraj was drawn up by C.R. Das and Bhagwan Das and presented to the Congress in 1923 and adopted as a party policy. Now, what was the plan or what did it recommend? This plan recommended a massive decentralization of government after independence. It said that the highest centers of governmental power should be reduced and the organ of administration should be the panchayat, organized into village, town, district, provincial, and all India's units of government. It must be remembered, however, that at this juncture, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress were not the only advocates of Panchayat. The enthusiasm for the village, for cooperation and for local self-government was shared by a variety of liberal colonial officials, particularly members of the government's revenue and agricultural departments. This was because they saw the intermediary class, whether it be moneylenders or lawyer politicians, as a drain upon society and a barrier to progress. As the nationalist struggle progressed, Gandhi became more ambitious for the idea of village self-government because he felt that when public opinion was aroused by the organization of panchayats, then there would not be any need of violence. But things changed again. For Panchayati Raj, things took a downhill after independence, and following Gandhi's death, though the possibility of a continuing judicial and administrative role for the panchayat was considered, it was criticized and rejected by the Indian Constituent Assembly. The view being held as by many who had held it previously as well, that such local organizations were prone to corruption. Ambedkar's experience of the suffering of the Mahar community gave him particular insights into the problem, as say some. Consequently, the only reference to the panchayats at all in the Indian Constitution was in Part 4, that is in the Directive Principles of the State Policy, which is non-justiciable and non-enforceable. It merely stated that the state should take steps to organize village panchayats and endow them with such power and authority as may be necessary to enable them to function as units of self-government. Now, the question that arises, why did the panchayats not come under the legally enforceable section of the Constitution? This question was also asked in the 1994 report of the Indian Social Science Institute. The answer is, as it's stated by the report of the Indian Social Science Institute, is that the urban and the rural elites, their representatives in politics right from the time of national freedom movement to the present times, and a bureaucracy conditioned by its class character, had a typical disdain for panchayat, and this has ever since remained intact. This disdain seems real enough in what has become a famous quote B.R. Ambedkar wrote, "What is the village but a sink of localism, den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism?" Now, the question that again arises, if it was shelved in the Constituent Assembly and finds its expression only in the non-enforceable part of the Constitution, then how was this idea revived? Well, one explanation points to the sort of financial pressure that first brought the panchayat experiment seriously, that first made the Britishers to think about such system. This again happened after independence. These pressures began to make themselves felt soon after the launch of the first 5-year plan. As the first 5-year plan concentrated its resources on the industrial sector, and it was continued in the second 5-year plan as well, it rapidly became apparent that there was no resources actually available to carry into effect the rural development. These shortcomings were manifested in the community development and national extension service programs, both of which were the subject of an inquiry by National Planning Committee study team led by Balwant Mehta, a member of parliament in 1957. The study team concluded that if these programs were to be effective and affordable, And if repeated interventions by officials were to be avoided, then there was a desperate need for a village level agency which could represent the entire community, assume responsibility, and provide necessary leadership for implementing development programs. The case for governmental decentralization was later affirmed by the National Development Council, and once again panchayats came back into the political agenda. The phrase Panchayati Raj came into fashion. Zealots even claim that it was coined by Jawaharlal Nehru, though it had obviously been previously used by Gandhi and many others. How was it implemented? Rajasthan was the first state to pass legislation authorizing the constitution of a new style of panchayat. The first, assuming largely administrative powers, was established at Nagaur, about 260 kilometers from Jaipur, the state capital, in October 1959. By 1959, every state had passed a Panchayati Act, and some sort of panchayat was thereafter established, in theory at least, in nearly every village. There was also strong support in favor of the Panchayati ideal amongst opposition groups. Jayaprakash Narayan, for example, was a great advocate of panchayats in the late 1960s and early 1970s, his vision being quite a radical one, championing the notion of partyless democracy. However, this was not without some very pertinent problems. The problems were that these panchayats were set up largely, as already stated, for development reasons, and although constituted at village levels, including a certain number of women and scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, the executive powers were not vested with the village authority. The executive powers usually lay at block level, where a block samiti was constituted by delegates from a number of villages. But it was not these delegates also who could call the plan of action. Executive powers here were shared with the government block development officer, and of course, above the block, there were also Zilla Parishads playing a supervisory and coordinating role. There was thus very little continuity with the primarily judicial panchayats of the 1920s, where they functioned at all. They served as a channel for development and improvement works. And when in the later 1960s, this village level panchayats, when various development programs flourished, these village level panchayats played little part in administrating them. The deficiency in this community development was highlighted in R.C. Jain's famous work, Grass Without Roots. We see that with the shift of government expenditure away from industrial projects and into rural development after 1966, funds were available. But though funds were available, and with that funds, trainings were arranged for officials who were appointed to carry on the business of this project implementation, it did nothing to empower the village communities. The block development officer flourished and was soon joined by a number of other specialist teams sent by different ministries, each of which set up their own communities and other means of consulting with villagers, but they were not at all willing to part with their pet projects and entrust the responsibility upon the village councils. Even as early as 1964, these problems were publicized in a seminar held by the All India Panchayat Parishad, a voluntary association of panchayat organization across India, presided over by Jayaprakash Narayan. The rapid deterioration of the panchayats constituted in the late 1950s and early 1960s was further underlined in the report of the Ashok Mehta Committee on Panchayati Raj Institutions, which was set up in December 1977 and included such luminaries such as EMS Nambudiri Pada and M.G. Ramachandran among its membership. The committee observed that the activities of the Panchayati Raj institutions, even at the block level, were meager. Their resource was limited and they had been stagnating, if not declining, since 1965. They further noted that these panchayats were mistrusted by the state government officials and that a growing range of development activities such as the Small Farmers Development Agency, the Drought-Prone Areas Program, and the Intensive Tribal Development Project were not being brought under the purview of the elected Zilla Parishad in states such as Gujarat and Maharashtra. The Panchayat Raj institutions, it said, was also dominated by economically or socially privileged sections of society. The solution and key recommendations of the Ashok Mehta Committee was that the panchayats to be brought closer to the people by putting executive powers in the hands of the Mandal Panchayats, which group together villages of 15,000 to 20,000 inhabitants with a single tier of district level panchayats above them. The recommendations of the Ashok Mehta Committee were not much heeded to because the idea of further reform was in any case shelved at a meeting of chief ministers. Probably they were already confident of their democratic credentials. This remained the situation for the next 5 years. The panchayats were constituted in many village levels but had only a few responsibilities. Development money was dispersed at the block level and remained largely in the hands of officials. A rare exception to this pattern is perhaps the experience in West Bengal, where Panchayat Raj functioned quite effectively. And the thing is, though it was successful in West Bengal, Orissa, Nagaland, but these exceptions tend to prove that the opposite was actually true, and decentralization with agrarian reform rarely went hand in hand. Now, this mixed and unsatisfactory state of affairs began to change dramatically in 1985 after Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister, when two committees were constituted. The first, under G.V.K Rao, was established to review the arrangements for rural development and poverty alleviation. It recommended the revitalization of Zilla Parishads with the appointment of District Development Commissioner as Chief Executive of Zilla Parishad. The second committee, chaired by H.M. Singhvi, proposed the reorganization of Panchayati Raj institutions and the setting up of effective village level committees. Following this report, the Sarkaria Commission on Center-State Relations and a Parliamentary Consultative Committee also recommended that there should be a significant strengthening of the Panchayati system. A bill proposing an amendment of the Constitution, the 64th, was drawn up and presented in the Parliament in May 1989. Now, initially it was not passed, it was rejected in the Rajya Sabha, but it was passed after being introduced as the 74th Amendment Bill in 1991. It was passed by the Lok Sabha on 22nd-23rd December 1992, and following its ratification by half the states, it achieved presidential assent in April 1993 as the 73rd Amendment to the Constitution. Now, along with the requirement to establish elected panchayats, it further required that 1/3 of municipal and panchayat seats should be reserved for women. Following the passage of the 73rd Amendment into law, in some cases, the state introduced radical measures which delegated significant power and responsibilities into panchayats. Rajasthan was once again amongst the first to respond with legislation passed in 1994 and elections in 1995. Some states, notably Andhra Pradesh, jumped the gun and evolved legislation extending Panchayati Raj into scheduled areas as well, though not always on favorable terms. The Andhra Pradesh Panchayati Act was in fact struck down by the Andhra Pradesh High Court after agitation by Adivasi groups. In 1996, therefore, the Lok Sabha passed a bill extending the proposed Panchayati system of the 73rd Amendment into all scheduled, that is Adivasi areas. Altogether, the 73rd Constitutional Amendment and the 1996 Extension Act proposed a radical upgrading of the juridical position of the panchayats, with which state-level administrations are now only beginning to come to terms. Though local level bodies have faced challenges and the Panchayati Raj system is also no exception, but the way it's evolving is not always presenting a dismal picture. Though a lot needs to be achieved, but the Panchayati Raj system, we cannot actually not agree that it has done nothing to the development of village life. Rather, Panchayati Raj system has revitalized the village life. Thank you.